And are the new innovations that we are talking about, are those really innovations that are driving productivity growth? Are those innovations that are driving quality of life, which quite often is not measured as an improvement in productivity? To some extent it's a measurement problem, but to some extent it is also an issue about where do innovations actually pay off. Do they pay off in terms of higher efficiency and lower cost? Or do they pay off in terms of higher quality of life? So who's going to benefit from these technologies? So there are major questions underlying that kind of quantitative figure that I was just describing to you. Now, the way I want to approach it in the next 20 minutes or so is by indeed taking it first of all from the productivity side, then look a little bit at what the contributions of various factors of growth to that productivity is, and then zoom in on one specific source of growth that I think is going to be crucial for making innovations contribute positively to growth in the longer term, and that is the investment in intangibles. Here are some very some major conclusions from an annual release that we do at the conference board every year on productivity. In January, we released a sort of latest productivity numbers. We have no time to go through this in great detail, but Eric already referred to the 2009 recession, which has had a major impact on the world economy. It actually has led to a slowing of productivity growth measured in terms of labor productivity of about 1%, but there have been large differences. The US actually has been doing very well. It actually grew productivity by 2.5%, but it mainly did that because it has just been very aggressive. US companies have been very aggressive in cutting down on their payroll about twice as fast as their slowdown in in output, and as a result, productivity growth in the third bullet point in per hour terms in the US was actually 2.5% positive. Whereas, for example, in the euro area, it was minus 1.3 negative because European companies have been very cautious in terms of laying off employees. So this is not all about innovation and about IT. To some extent, this is about institutional frameworks about how rapidly can you hire and fire and what kind of options do companies have in order to keep the labor with them or in order to lay them off and perhaps rehire them as quickly as they can. What is very important from this kind of work is that among emerging economies, we have continued to see pretty good productivity performance. China, for example, has been one of the best productivity performers for a long time and kept doing that in 2009, and lots of other emerging economies have been following in the same direction. Here you see a very quick kind of summary picture of the labor productivity numbers over the past couple of years. This is a so-called heat chart. And this chart basically tells you you don't have to look at the numbers, you can just look at the color. If it is blue, it's great. If it is red, it's pretty bad. And here you can see how, first of all, 2009 was obviously a terrible year in this sort of, 7-year framework. But still there are large differences across countries. This is in terms of per person employed. The United States still having a positive productivity growth of about 1%. Whereas European countries were all in a very deep red. But look at China, kept having a growth of about 8.2% in labor, in terms of labor productivity growth during 2009. And even India, a country that has significantly faster employment growth than China, still kept growing in terms of positive numbers. Now, these are labor productivity numbers. But to really understand what is going on with technology as a source of growth and innovation, we have to sort of drill down a little deeper. And again, Eric has already helped us to set up us a little by introducing the term multi-factor or total factor productivity growth. So there are two different terms of productivity you need to understand here. Labor productivity is basically output relative to the number of hours worked, whereas total factor productivity is output relative to all the factor inputs that you are using in the economy. It's hours worked, it's labor, but it's also energy and materials and service inputs, and very importantly, machinery, structures, information and communication technology, capital like computers and software, and so on. So it's that total factor productivity number that gives us a little bit sort of a more refined kind of view on what is happening to the efficiency by which we are making use of these various sources of growth. Once we have that concept, we can begin to understand a little bit better where some of the differences in growth between economies are coming from. And this is something that we call growth accounting. And that's basically a way by taking that growth rate of gross domestic product that I've been introducing to you and say, let's see if we can decompose that into various contributions of sources of growth. So if you sort of look here at the United States, which is on the left-hand side, and we made a distinction between 1995-2005, which was this period of very rapid growth that I was talking about earlier, and then 2005 to 2008, which was this period in which we already saw growth and productivity slowing down. Now what you see here is how these sources of growth are contributing to that growth of GDP. So in the United States from 1995 to 2005, GDP was growing by more than 3%. Some of that coming from labor quantity, so this is the number of hours worked, the growth in the number of hours worked. Some of it coming from labor quality, which is the improvement in skills of the labor force. Some of it coming from investment in what we call non-IT capital. So this is capital like structures, like machinery and equipment and that kind of thing. And then a pretty good contribution from IT capital, so computers, communication equipment, software. And then at the top you have this total factor productivity concept, the important sort of factor that is telling us the efficiency by which we are using these various sources of growth. Look pretty good, but then since 2005, what we're actually seeing is that that total factor productivity number is turning zero or negative. I mean, there's always a little bit of a margin of uncertainty, but that positive number is basically disappearing. And as a result, growth has been slowing quite considerably. There have been some more things going on, but that's probably the most important effect. It looks as if we are not using these input factors as effectively, efficiently, and productively anymore as we did in the past. And as a result, if you compare that with the euro area, the US economy actually is not growing much faster anymore than the euro area, which wasn't a very rapid growing economy anyway. And in the case of the euro area, we also have seen that the total factor productivity, which was less than the US anyway, but it's also disappeared, right? So it seems that we really have a kind of a problem in these advanced economies that productivity by which we are using our resources hasn't been as good as it was before 2005. Now, before I go and compare that with the emerging economies, it's kind of interesting to zoom in a little bit more where the contribution of that productivity growth is coming from. And this chart, I only want you to take one thing away. And again, Eric already referred to it. This is not just about high tech and about the production of these new technologies, but a lot of that growth in terms of productivity in the US is actually coming from the services sector of the economy. The retail sector, the distribution sector in general, also the financial sector has been very important in terms of productivity growth and contributing to that growth from 2000 to 2007. Whereas in the case of the European Union, perhaps the manufacturing sector as a whole has been more important in terms of a contributor to that productivity growth. But that's a bit of a side note. What I really wanted to point out to you is the comparative performance between these advanced economies that's slowing down in productivity growth, which is the blue line here, and these are not annual numbers. This is a somewhat more smoothed trend of growth. But at the same time, we have seen the emerging and developing economies accelerating their productivity growth very rapidly. So on the one hand, we have seen the advanced economies slowing down productivity growth since 2005. And at the same time, we have seen the emerging economies catching up with the advanced economies in terms of productivity growth and subsequently taking over and now having a productivity growth which on average is about 4 percentage points higher than the productivity growth in the advanced economies. And this is quite important. This is not just China. China is an important factor here. But as we have seen earlier, there are lots of emerging economies that are now accelerating their productivity growth. And is suggesting that, the growth in these economies is not just a matter anymore of, lots of cheap resources, but increasingly also a matter of a greater efficiency by which the labor in these economies is going to be used. And that's, as Eric said earlier, the most sustainable source of growth is this kind of productivity growth.